The next few weeks passed somewhat uneventfully. My days started early at first light and were filled with fixing fence, working cattle, and feeding hay. After the morning feeding was done, I cut and baled hay every evening and made sure that the center pivot pumps were lubricated and filled with diesel every day. I made the rounds to every pasture that had a water tank at least twice a day and ensured that the wells were pumping enough water to keep them all full for the cattle to drink. And of course, there was always a little odd jobs that tended to crop up just to keep life interesting. All in all, it was good living, doing exactly what a young cowpoke like me loved to do. Mr. Blair pretty much kept to himself once he was confident that I knew how to make my way around the ranch and wasn't likely to kill his cattle out of ignorance or stupidity. I never did get to meet Mrs. Blair, as she never really seemed to leave the farmhouse. And Mr. Blair didn't seem very amenable to having company. I had waved to her, though, a time or two when I saw her face peering out of one of the windows. She looked healthy and cheerful enough as she waved back, and I didn't get the impression that she was being held against her will or anything by Mr. Blair. Just not very sociable, I guess. I did notice that Mr. Blair was a heavy drinker, who made it a habit of guzzling a full handle of whiskey each and every day. I also noticed that it was a pretty good idea to avoid him after noontime, since by that point Mr. Blair had typically imbibed enough that the whiskey tended to inflame his already royal in temper. There were a few occasions where we exchanged some heated words over a seemingly innocuous incident, like that time when I had been driving the tractor through one of the north pastures cutting hay, and the ground had given way under one of the drive tires, getting the tractor stuck. I'd been able to hike back up to the shop and grab another working tractor in order to pull it out with, but my God, did Mr. Blair pitch a fit when he saw the new hole in his field. Upon closer inspection, it had appeared that I had run over one of those Warren tunnels that Mr. Blair had told me that the coyotes were digging all over the place. Mr. Blair had me fill in the hole to his liking while he watched, and then tasked me with bringing him a half-dozen left ears from those mangy animals, which I did by the next evening, much to my disgust. Those vile things made my skin crawl. The only time I was convinced that we might actually come to blows was the morning that I had been fixing fence line in the far northern pasture, not far from the farmhouse itself. Now, I'd been slowly working my way around that pasture for the better part of a morning, and the sun was doing its best to turn me into a little pile of ash the whole time. What meager breeze there was seemed more interested in blowing dust in my eyes rather than trying to cool me down at all. My shoulders were sore and chafing under the backpack of tools and supplies that I was hauling, and I had managed to smash my thumb a couple of times whilst hammering in fencing staples. You know, just another typical day of the life of a ranch hand. On the other side of the fence a ways sat about 100 acres of densely wooded forest, the only such grove I'd seen in the area. As I worked my way closer, the deep shade under those trees started looking almighty hospitable. I glanced up at my blazing yellow oppressor, wiping the stinging sweat out of my eyes, and determined that it was about time for lunch anyway. Gathering my tools into my satchel, I hoofed it on over to the edge of the wood, pulling the pack from my shoulders and settling under the cool shade of a massive oak tree. Laying my head back against that big old trunk, I let out a big sigh and took a second to soak in the moment. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves above, orchestrating what sounded like a subdued tone of applause from a million tiny paper people. I closed my eyes and felt a similar sort of appreciation. My nose wrinkled as it suddenly caught a horribly rank smell wafting in on the breeze. The rustle of undergrowth behind me caused my eyes to pop open and my head to turn towards the sound, leaning around a massive trunk to peer into the gloom of the woods. The noise had stopped as I moved, but that stench had only grown stronger. I placed a hand over my nose and mouth, my mouth working open and close in a futile attempt to rid my tongue of that heavy taste of rot and decay that seemed to ooze in. Coughing, I stood up, grabbing a claw hammer from my pack as I did so, and I gripped it tightly in my other hand. Hunching forward, I squinted my eyes to try to find any sign of movement within the dense stand of trunks and undergrowth that receded back into the pitch-black shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck and arms prickled, and then slowly stood at attention. My body tensed, and the blood pumping through my ears demanded of me to get the hell out of there. But I could not yet discern why. It was then that I noticed a soft rustling noise from the dark, quieter even than the leaves were above my head. It sounded almost like old leather being drawn across wet grass, heavy and low. My eyes then caught the glimmer of light from the darkness, 2 points of light surfacing from the deep. I raised my hammer instinctively, my eyes widening as I thought I heard my name being whispered in the wind in a rasping, guttural tone. The shadows seemed to draw towards me, and those gleaming points of light were at the very center. My legs, they refused to move, and my upright arm was locked in place, shaking from the effort I was putting into budge it. I just couldn't wrench my eyes away from those flames in the abyss. I heard myself scream as one of the shadows slithered forward suddenly to coil around my left leg. An icy cold stabbed through my body at its touch. A dozen more glinting eyes blinked open from the darkness at irregular intervals, all coming to affix their malevolent gaze on me and piercing my soul with their ill intent. I heard a myriad of voices drooling nonsensical syllables, all while hearing my own name being whispered with palpable hunger. I felt my paralyzed body being dragged inexorably into the darkness, towards all those blinking, snake-slitted eyes. I heard my screams get louder. A big hand enveloped my shoulder and roughly jerked me forwards onto the dry grass. I sprawled there for a second, collecting my wits, my head fuzzy and my eyes blearing from sleep. The sun was on its way down towards the horizon, the heat of the midday having dissipated considerably. I realized that Mr. Blair was yelling at me from behind. "God damn your lazy ass!" I heard him say. His words were slurring heavily. "There's no way I'm gonna keep paying a ranch hand who spends the day napping when he should be working. I don't know what kind of good-for-nothing louts you worked for in the past, but I tell you right now, I'm not gonna put up with this shit." I got up to my hands and knees and pushed myself up from the ground and turned around. My face was heating up from both anger at his reaction and embarrassment for what I had done. I'd never fallen asleep on the job before. "Look, I apologize," I said. "But see here now, you've got no cause to go..." Mr. Blair's eyes flared at the start of my response, and to my amazement, he moved in with such speed that he had my collar in his fist, and I found myself half raised up off the ground before I had processed exactly what had just happened. I blame the fact that I was still in the process of waking up. Must have still been slow on the uptake at that moment. Bracing, I brought my fists up, preparing to fight Goliath mid-dangle. The smell of cheap whiskey and bad breath hit me in the face like a damp blanket. Before I could throw a swing, however, Mr. Blair tossed me back onto the ground, and I landed on my rump hard enough to blur my vision and tweak my tailbone. "I have every cause. This is my land, you hear me?" he screamed, spittle flying from between his fat lips. "And no tin-horn cowpunch is gonna tell me otherwise." He whirled around then and wobbled off towards the pickup that he had parked along the fence line. "Then stay out of that grove," he yelled over his shoulder. "My kin are buried in there, and only me and mine are gonna set foot in there. If I see you anywhere near it again, I'll toss your ass right over my property line for good." And with that, he sped off. I clenched my fists so hard that my palms bled, and got my breathing back to normal, and then stood up once more and started gathering my tools and rucksack. Now, I don't normally like making it a policy to fight with my boss. That kind of thing gets around in the ranching community and makes it kind of hard for a man to find work after that. But I swore then and there that if Mr. Blair came at me like that again, I was going to put that resolution to the test. But luckily for both of us, it seemed that Mr. Blair did not hold this confrontation against me the following day. Whether or not that was because he didn't remember it due to the drink, or if it was that after he gave it some thought, he knew that if he ran me off, he'd just be up to his eyeballs in extra work, and not likely to find another ranch hand on short notice that was dumb enough to come work for him. So I just did my best to minimize the frequency of these altercations and focused on enjoying my solo time doing chores, which luckily was the vast majority of the week. I did learn soon after the reason why Mr. Blair drank so much. One evening, as the sun was setting and we were wrapping up work for the day, he told me that it was to dull the pain of his joints and back. He said that he had gotten into a pretty bad situation while riding a young gelding when he was younger. And hopefully for that gelding a few 100 pounds lighter. He apparently had been attempting to rope this particularly ornery bull. While the details he gave me were fuzzy, I knew all too well the dangers of tangling with a bull that had no mind to go where you wanted him to. Mr. Blair told me that he had roped that bull around the neck, but before he had secured the rope to his saddle horn, that bull had jerked him plumb clean out of the saddle. Now, not letting go of his rope, his first mistake, Mr. Blair had found himself then being dragged across the pasture. His second and final mistake of that encounter had been when he had tried to bring his legs up in front of him to plant his feet in the dirt to slow down that bull. Needless to say, when his feet finally found purchase on a passing log, that bull wasn't fazed none. Though Mr. Blair's knees discovered a whole new and exciting direction in which to bend. I never will understand why some cowboys think that they're all 10 foot tall and made of lead. But then again, I've done my share of stupid things on a ranch, and I guess you need at least a measure of that kind of crazy to even do this job in the first place. My nights were divided between plucking ham-fistedly at an old guitar that I had found propped up in a corner of the old bunkhouse, and traveling down to that bar in the next farm in town. It had taken me a few trips out there before I finally caught up with Devin, but when I did, we hit it off just as well as I had hoped. Every time I saw her, I was just plumb staggered by how beautiful she was. She was a pretty good dancer, too, and we spent many a night circling the tiny dance floor to the crackling tune of an ancient jukebox set by the bar. I came to find out pretty quickly why so many of those songs had talked about just taking a girl like this out to dance. I lived for those nights. And then, after we wore each other out and were thoroughly dizzy, we would typically spend a few hours lost in flirtatious conversation, punctuated by more than a few beers. After she determined that I was good and sloshed, she typically would drag me up to the old karaoke machine for a few songs. Now, I never could claim much talent in that particular area, but Devin, on the other hand, had the voice of an angel, and more than made up for my lackluster tones. It was after the first of these wild nights that I asked her just how the hell such a beautiful and talented young woman as her was still stuck in a backwater town like this. She laughed and said, "Ever since I could remember, it's been my dream to go to Nashville and try my hand at singing in the bars to get noticed. I always pictured some fancy-dressed man in pearl snaps and pointy boots walking up to me and showing me his card and telling me I was going to be famous." "Don't laugh." I couldn't help it. "You know, I've seen dirty movies that started that way." I chuckled at her. She slapped my arm. "You just shut up. That's how nobodies like me become famous." "By doing a porno?" I howled. She slapped my arm so hard that time my beer spilled. Laughing, she said that I was just jealous because my voice sounded like a cow being run over slowly by a train. "You got me. I guess I've got no choice but to offer my skills at playing the guitar while you do all the singing." Her eyes lit up. "Oh? You play?" she asked excitedly. "Oh, yeah. Exactly as well as I sing." She grimaced at that, and we both chuckled for a while. Her tone became suddenly somber. "After my parents were killed in a car crash a couple years ago, I decided that there just wasn't any reason why I couldn't leave my hometown and all its painful memories, bet it all on that dream. Problem was, I didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, and I wrecked my car just outside the county. So, here I am." She told me that she had no idea what it was that she had hit that night, only that it had appeared so fast in front of her car that it was too dark for her to get a good look at it. But it certainly did enough damage for her to figure that it had to have been something big. Not only did it destroy the front end of her car, but it had lumbered off into the darkness before she had fully recovered from the crash. The impact had caused her head to hit the steering wheel, and she blacked out for a little while. For some reason, the airbag had failed to deploy. But that didn't surprise her really, since the car had been a piece of junk well before that thing had been reduced to a 2-ton paperweight. The car had been totaled, and she had spent the last of her money renting a room in town. She soon got a job at the gas station and was now saving up to buy another junker and finish her pilgrimage to the city of music. She smiled at that thought and then turned to me with a wink and said, "At least it looks like I can now have some fun while I'm stuck here in the meantime." I drank to that. I found myself thinking about her throughout my days working on the ranch. I just couldn't seem to shake her from my thoughts, no matter how much I really didn't try to. Every day as I slung hay bales or sat itchy in an open cab tractor while cutting hay, or even mucking out horse stalls, all it was I looked forward to seeing her again, and the days slipped by in a comfortable routine. One evening, she surprised me by popping up at the bunkhouse, having convinced one of her girlfriends to drop her off there and then take off back into town. Now, while I was ecstatic to see her, I was reluctant to let her see the inside of my bunkhouse. It had been an especially hard working week, and, like any self-respecting bachelor pad, the place had begun to smell a bit harsh. Dirty and neglected laundry scattered the floor, dirty dishes filled the sink, and the place was in a general disarray. The state of the place had been compounded by the fact that, instead of taking the time in the evenings to clean up after myself, I more than often had found myself just slipping out the door and down the road to the bar to go see her. There was only so much time in the day, after all. But there was no way I was going to let her see that mess as her first impression of me. Thinking quickly on my feet, I greeted her with a hug and a quick kiss and exclaimed how happy I was at the surprise. She grinned mischievously and started heading for the front door, trailing my hand in hers. Spinning her around in one of our well-practiced dance moves, I brought her into my arms and kissed her again, much longer this time. I placed a knuckle under her chin and lifted her head up to gaze at the star-studded evening sky. "You know," I said, "this night is too good a one to waste. And I will say that those stars up there are the second best thing about living way out here in this part of the country." She grinned. "And what was the first thing you like out here?" she asked with a smirk. "The smell of cow farts in the morning, of course." I laughed. The resulting arm smack was worth the exasperated smile that appeared on her face. "Here," I said, looping my arm around her little waist and guiding her over to my truck. "You just get in and I'll be right back with some goodies. I won't be a tick." She bit her lip as if contemplating the idea and then broke out in a grin and nodded excitedly. Inwardly relieved, I ushered her inside the truck and was caught for a moment by her arms around my neck as she robbed me by force of yet another kiss. "Hurry back. I want to have some fun tonight," she whispered in my ear. My stomach flipped in the tone of her voice, and my pants were suddenly trying to strangle me. Winking, I closed the door and tried my best not to run like hell for that front door. But my efforts to remain cool were not entirely successful, as I definitely trotted up there. As I was halfway back to the bunkhouse, she called for me to grab that old guitar that I had mentioned. I grimaced to myself, knowing that my music skills in that department might just ruin the mood I was lucky enough to have dropped in my lap tonight. But I grabbed it anyway. Maybe we just wouldn't get around to revealing how many thumbs one man could possess when playing a guitar. After hastily grabbing a blanket, a flashlight, and a newly opened bottle of whiskey, I stuffed these items into a spare backpack I had, slung the guitar over my other shoulder, and then returned to the truck. Thus supplied, we headed out into the evening twilight. As we meandered through the dirt roads that snaked their way over and between the hill-covered landscape, I found myself lost in the moment. The smell of her perfume, the sensation of her warm thigh pressed up against mine, her arms wrapped around my elbow as I steered the truck with no particular destination in mind. We joked and laughed and stole quick, wet kisses in the gathering darkness, and just reveled in each other's alluring company. We were passing by the silhouette of one of the old dilapidated farmhouses. You know, the one with the tree sprouting up from the middle? When she turned to peer at it and asked me just what it was. I explained, and her eyes lit up with excitement. "We should totally go and explore it. Who knows? Maybe the place is haunted," she said, laughing. Chuckling as well, I pulled into the unkempt drive and headed for the abandoned husk of that farm home. Parking the truck as near to the house as I could, we hopped out, grabbed what supplies I had brought for the trip, and started making our way towards what appeared to be the front door. The flashlight I had brought from the truck was a cheap little thing, and it barely illuminated the path ahead of us. It was a moonless night, and although the stars overhead blazed in a parade of brilliant fanfare, they provided very little ambient light to see by down here on the ground. We were about halfway to the farmhouse when the flashlight revealed a large mound in front of us, about 5 foot high, that we had to skirt all the way around. Upon circumnavigating that miniature hill, I noticed that there was a pair of doors on the side facing the farmhouse. Or more accurately, had been a pair of doors, for one of them had long since rotted off its hinges and lay in moldering pieces scattered around the front of the opening. The other door swung listlessly in the night air, groaning softly on its rusted hinges. I shined the flashlight into the opening and saw a series of stone steps descending at a sharp incline into the darkness. The weak beam of light I had to work with was not nearly strong enough to illuminate the bottom of the staircase. It just provided a glimpse of many steps fading down into the pitch darkness. Squinting, I leaned in closer to peer into the void. All at once, my eyes seemed to catch a swirling, slithering movement just beyond the edge of the flashlight's illumination. I froze, and I could have sworn that momentarily I could faintly hear what could only be described as a wet rasping of flesh against stone. My body tensed up, and I intently studied the darkness, trying to determine if my mind was just playing tricks on me, or if I had really heard something. The hairs on my arms and neck began to rise. I felt my arm jerk backwards rapidly, which caused me to suck in a big gulp of air. I inhaled some spit with it and started coughing violently. Devin broke out in loud laughter at my own scare. "We haven't even made it into the house yet, and already you're jumping out of your skin over some old root cellar," she chided as I struggled to get my coughing under control. Before I was able to launch a particularly sarcastic response, she rolled her eyes, snatched the flashlight out of my hand, giggled, and then dragged me a short ways onward toward the house by hand. Grinning to myself, I allowed her to lead ahead, content to just stare at her bouncing silhouette and the meager light that she was pointing ahead so that she could see where to place her next step. As we approached the farmhouse, it became clear just how long the structure had been abandoned to the elements. Thick vines blanketed the roof and exterior walls. None of the windows that I could see had survived intact, and the scent of earthy decay hung heavy in the air. The tree had grown up from the center of the house and spread its canopy of densely foliated branches, resembling to me for all the world like a hand having punched upwards through the roof that was now grasping desperately toward the starry sky. The sight was eerily mesmerizing. There was no sign of what had once been the front door, only what now appeared to be a tunnel entrance framed in vines. We cautiously entered the old house, proceeding carefully and watching where we stepped. We picked our way through what seemed to be a short foyer entryway, and soon emerged into a common living area that was now dominated by the massive trunk of the tree that had claimed this old house as its domain. The ruined roof lay in scattered remnants all around the base of the trunk, but there was a relatively clear area on the floor closest to the tree. We tiptoed around the rubble and paused to gaze up in wonder at the sight of a patchwork collage of tree branches and leaves that partially obscured a star-filled sky. I reached over and took her hand again, neither of us really able to tear our eyes away from the strange beauty that overshadowed us. Her hand squeezed mine, and we enjoyed sharing the moment in silent appreciation. I was the first to break that hypnotic rapture. Reaching into my pack, I pulled out the blanket and unfurled it onto the ground at the base of the tree trunk. I then removed the whiskey bottle and placed it on one corner of the blanket, and then put the old guitar down next to that. With a goofy flourish, I beckoned my lady to have a seat, and with a giggle, she did. We sat next to each other with our backs resting against the tree trunk, our heads laid back and inclining upward once more. "It's so beautiful here," she said in a hushed tone. I pulled her close and she rested her head on my shoulder. "Couldn't get much better," I replied. "Actually, some music would be nice," she prodded. I groaned audibly and thought like hell for a way to change the subject. Only one thing seemed to come to mind. I pulled her in for a series of amazing kisses, if I do say so myself, after which she immediately leaned over, grabbed the guitar, and thrust it back at me. "No way you're getting out of this," she snickered. With an overly dramatic sigh, I took the guitar and threw the strap over my head. "Fine," I relinquished, and started playing. She was all grins when I finally started strumming out a few chords. And to my surprise, I was doing pretty well, despite my pounding heart trying to punch a hole straight out my chest. I even managed to keep my voice from shaking too awful as I sang her a few of my favorites. Then I decided to go for broke and picked out a particularly romantic last song, and I watched as she melted as I started singing to her. As I did, I once again got lost in the realization that she was by far the most beautiful woman I had ever known. And I don't even remember finishing the second half of that song. Our eyes never unlocked, and suddenly I realized that she had gotten up and hugged me, drawing my head down for another long, passionate kiss. I guess I must have finished singing by then. That kiss was just the spark, and for the next few hours, we warmed ourselves in a fire that we built together. The piercing sound of a woman's chilling scream of horror stabbed into my ears, dragging my mind violently from unconsciousness. I blinked my eyes rapidly in the darkness, fighting to remember where I was and desperately trying to see something, anything. Devon's throat-rending wails continued, quickly turning raspy as her vocal cords were overwhelmed. "Devon!" I yelled, my hands frantically scrambling around in the dark to search for anything that I could use to help her. There was no conscious thought in my mind, only the animal fury and desperation that emerges in times when someone you love is in danger. My fingers brushed against the cylindrical body of the flashlight, and I snatched it up and fumbled for the switch. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I finally found it, and a feeble beam of light pierced the void. My screams joined in with hers immediately after, engulfing the world in a horrifying cacophony. My mind refused to process that mass of slithering shapes and roiling limbs that twisted and oozed before me. Razor-toothed maws opened and clanged shut amidst that liquid darkness. Dozens of half-recognizable heads and arms and hoof-tipped feet wriggled and flailed around the mass of formless evil that rose to tower ever higher over me. Devon's fair naked form hung there, suspended in the air by monstrous appendages and squirming tentacles that dripped black sludge wherever they touched her. Dozens of eyelids lazily cracked open to look at us both, their slit pupils gleaming moistly in the trembling beam of light cast from my hand. A few of the mouths bared their teeth in a vicious grin, while others howled mockingly at our screams. I tore my eyes away from that nightmare and locked gaze with Devon, whose tear-streamed eyes begged me to save her, as she screamed incoherently into the night. Instinctively, my hand found purchase on an old piece of lumber at my side, and I lunged forward, brandishing it desperately, howling all the while in pure terror and anger. There had been no conscious decision to do so, only a bestial desperation. It wasn't enough. The side of the creature ripped open from within, and a plethora of small, amorphous creatures poured out and scuttled blindingly fast toward my hurtling body, little arms and tentacles and stubby appendages arresting my forward progress. I flailed at them wildly with my improvised weapon, feeling the soft, fleshy impacts reverberate through my arm and watching as their bodies burst open like overripe fruit, only to have even more greasy forms slither out from within. They covered my body with their cold, wet, stinking shapes, dragging me down to the floor and wresting the piece of wood from my grasp. I was pinned, helpless as these vile things flowed over me, some whispering, gurgling syllables and slobbering my name into my ear with their vaguely human-like, half-melted faces. My screams turned more from horror to revulsion and anger at their domination. I heard Devon scream impossibly louder, and I wrenched my neck around to peer up at her. Her eyes locked once more, and I watched helplessly as she was dragged rapidly out of the house by a monstrous blob of flesh and shadow and disappeared into the night beyond. My last glimpse of that frightened desperation in her eyes broke something in me. As her screams receded into the darkness, I felt my mind tearing loose of its moorings, and I began to thrash and claw and bite and roar with complete abandon. I tore loose from the 1,000 grips placed all over my body. I smashed, I rent, and stabbed, and battered my way back to my feet, ripping mucus-covered shapes from all over my skin and stomping them into the earth below my feet, or simply flinging them out into the surrounding darkness. Their high-pitched wails took the place of Devon's screams in the night. Once freed of most of them, I charged out into the direction that Devon had disappeared, realizing that somehow I had maintained a grip on the flashlight throughout the whole ordeal. I pointed it ahead and followed the trail of black slime and destruction that marked the path of that behemoth out of the house and into the yard outside. It led straight to the root cellar, the stone stairway descending into the abyss. I paused, realizing that I wasn't wearing any clothes and had nothing but the flashlight in my hand. But before I could formulate any sort of plan, I heard Devon's screams echoing up from the deep, and blind instinct took over once more. I aimed that flashlight down the stone steps and descended desperately downwards into the unknown.